Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very strange. The medieval mindset that still quietly runs our life. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's slightly ridiculous journey together. You probably think the 9 to F5 schedule came from the Industrial Revolution, from clever Victorian men in waistcoats calculating the perfect number of working hours before employees started dying. But no, it came from monks. Back in the Middle Ages, monks were the only people organized enough to tell time and irritating enough to make everyone else follow it. Their lives ran on a sacred endless loop of bells. Morning bells, midday bells, bells for prayer, bells for eating, bells for regretting that you became a monk. It was less a spiritual journey and more a divine alarm system with extra guilt. The day was divided into what they called canonical hours, matins, lords, prime, ter, sex, nun, vespers, and compline, which sounds less like prayer times and more like rejected Harry Potter spells. At every interval, monks would stop whatever they were doing to chant, kneel, or stare blankly into eternity. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about obedience. You weren't supposed to think. You were supposed to synchronize with God, the abbey, and whoever was in charge of the bell tower. And yes, there was always that monk who rang it 2 minutes early just to watch the world burn. Then over the centuries, the world outside caught the contagion. Towns scheduled their markets by church bells. Guilds used them to mark work hours. And eventually, factories copied the system wholesale, minus the praying, plus screaming managers. When the Industrial Revolution rolled in, someone basically said, let's take the monastic routine, remove the faith, and add paperwork. And thus the modern workday was born. The monks at least got silence, wine, and a robe that doubled as pajamas. You get fluorescent lights and Slack notifications. Even your lunch break has roots in monastic timekeeping. The sex hour when monks pause to pray and maybe sneak in a snack before continuing their divine spreadsheets. So, next time your alarm goes off at 7 a.m. and you drag yourself toward another day of labor in exchange for rent and mild back pain, remember you're not modern. You're medieval, just without the chanting or the forgiveness. The 9 to 5 didn't evolve. It escaped the monastery, put on a suit, and learned to say, let's circle back on that. If you've ever sneezed in public and someone muttered, bless you, congratulations. You've just participated in one of humanity's oldest and dumbest reflexes. It's not politeness. It's medieval panic that never got the memo about germ theory. Back in the 6th century, when the plague was having its European world tour, sneezing was not a mild inconvenience. It was a bad omen. If you sneezed once, people assumed you were infected. If you sneezed twice, they started dividing your possessions. The logic was simple. When you sneezed, your soul tried to escape through your nose. The devil, apparently lurking nearby, might seize the opportunity to snatch it midair. Enter Pope Gregory the Great, who in 590 CE decided that every sneeze needed divine intervention. He ordered the faithful to respond with, God bless you, effectively turning respiratory function into a team sport. Every bless you was an emergency prayer, a miniature exorcism for people with hay fever. The phrase spread faster than the plague itself. Soon every village in Europe was collectively blessing each other into exhaustion. Nobody could sneeze in peace. Imagine the soundscape. Church bells, roosters, and 40 villagers shouting, God bless you, every time someone inhaled pollen. And it worked. Not medically, but socially. Saying bless you became a way of proving you weren't the kind of monster who'd let your neighbor die unblessed. Refusing to say it was basically witchcraft. The superstition stuck. Even after centuries of science, hygiene, and vaccines, we still bless people who sneeze like it's 1348. No one believes their soul's escaping anymore, but we still panic at the sound of nasal explosions. Meanwhile, the only thing truly escaping during a sneeze is 100,000 droplets of bacteria at 100 miles per hour directly into your face. And nobody blesses you for that. So, next time someone sneezes and you instinctively mumble, bless you, just know you're reenacting a medieval ritual invented to keep Satan out of someone's sinuses. You're not being polite. You're participating in a 1,000-year-old mass delusion, and somehow it's still considered good manners. The next time you twirl spaghetti or politely stab a piece of chicken, remember in medieval Europe, that simple act would have gotten you labeled as a heretic. Yes, the fork, that harmless little utensil in your cutlery drawer, was once considered a tool of Satan. It arrived in Western Europe around the 11th century, carried by wealthy Xantine nobles who used small golden versions to eat dainty bites of food without getting their hands dirty. Logical, right? Wrong. The church immediately had a meltdown. Clergymen declared that using a fork was an insult to God because according to them, the Almighty had already provided the perfect eating tools, fingers. The idea that someone might prefer metal over flesh apparently bordered on blasphemy. One famous case involved a Xantine princess who married into the Venetian royal family. She brought her gold forks with her and the local priests lost their collective minds. When she died of the plague shortly after, the clergy smugly declared that her death was divine punishment for daring to use a shiny pronged stick instead of her God-given digits. For centuries, Europeans continued to eat with their hands like cavemen in fancy clothes. Even Renaissance nobles hesitated to use forks because it seemed unnatural. Knives and spoons were fine. One stabbed, one scooped, both biblical enough. But the fork had vibes. Ironically, people also started dying of foodborne illness because, shockingly, dirty fingers aren't hygienic. But no amount of dysentery could out-argue the church's logic. God made hands. Ergo, use them. It wasn't until the 17th century when Italy's fashionable elite decided forks were elegant that the rest of Europe caved. And as always, the English joined last, declaring forks effeminate until someone important used one in public. So next time you sit at a table and politely twirl your pastor, know this. You're performing an act that was once seen as morally questionable. The medieval church fought against sanitation, elegance, and table decorum and lost, which in a poetic way makes every dinner with cutlery a tiny victory for common sense over organized superstition, or as the priests would have called it, temptation served in silver. If you think bachelor parties today are chaotic, imagine them with swords. In the Middle Ages, before marriage was about love or shared Netflix accounts, it was a financial transaction. But even back then, men couldn't resist having one last night of poor decisions before signing their lives away. Thus was born the medieval stag night, the original bachelor party. Knights would gather in taverns or manors, drink ale until their helmets didn't fit, gamble away their horses, and loudly declare eternal loyalty to freedom, which usually lasted about 8 hours. These celebrations were supposed to honor the groom's transition into responsibility. In practice, they were an excuse to see how much a man could consume before falling into a moat. The stag symbolized virility and wildness, which is medieval for drunken regret. Guests would toast the groom's bravery for entering matrimony while quietly taking bets on how long he'd survive domestic life. Someone would inevitably challenge someone else to a duel, and at least one man would mistake the bride's cousin for a barmaid. The church hated these parties, of course. Priests called them feasts of sin, which, to be fair, was accurate. They warned that drunkenness before marriage led to damnation. The knights naturally took this as a challenge. Over time, the tradition trickled down from nobles to townsmen who replaced castles with taverns and armor with leather shoes. But the spirit remained. Eat, drink, and behave terribly because tomorrow you're legally obligated not to. Even the morning after rituals were familiar. There were hangovers, awkward silences, and promises never to speak of what happened. The only real difference between then and now is that medieval men didn't have smartphones to record the evidence. So, when you see a modern groom stumbling out of a bar wearing a plastic crown and regret, you're witnessing history. It's the same tradition, just without the swords, the plague, and the moral authority of a guy named Sir Geoffrey trying to juggle flaming torches while yelling for love. Bachelor parties didn't evolve. They just downgraded from chain mail to matching t-shirts. And somewhere, a medieval monk is still praying for all of them. When someone dies today, we instinctively dress in black. It feels respectful, somber, even timeless. But the truth is, it's just a medieval fashion trend that got wildly out of hand. The color of mourning used to depend on geography. The Romans wore white to funerals, clean, symbolic, and excellent for reflecting heat while you mourned under the Italian sun. But medieval Europe looked at that and said, no, let's make grief depressing and stylish. Black dye was expensive in the Middle Ages, which meant only the wealthy could afford to look properly devastated. Peasants, of course, couldn't afford sorrow in fabric form, so they wore whatever was clean, which statistically was nothing. The nobles, however, made mourning an event. Draped in black wool and veils, they wailed theatrically through the streets because grief, like everything else, had to be performative. The church loved it. Black symbolized humility before God. And conveniently, it made the clergy's wardrobe choices look pious instead of lazy. Over time, the color of mourning spread to every social class because nothing says repentance like wearing something that absorbs both heat and despair. By the 14th century, black funerals were the ultimate power move. Kings died in black. Widows lived in black. Entire courts spent years in coordinated sadness. Queen Victoria later revived the custom centuries later by staying in mourning black for 40 years, a record-breaking emotional hostage situation. Of course, the color eventually lost its religious meaning and just stuck. Now we all show up to funerals dressed like accountants who misfiled eternity because the Middle Ages decided grief needed a dress code. Ironically, the rest of the world didn't follow. In much of Asia, mourners still wear white, the color of purity. In Africa, bright colors symbolize a life well lived. Meanwhile, in the West, we prefer to look like a collective tax audit for the dead. So, next time you attend a funeral in black, remember you're not channeling timeless reverence. You're just following a 1,000-year-old medieval fashion rule invented by rich people trying to look holy. And as with all fashion trends, it's never really been about the dead. It's about proving you cared more stylishly than everyone else. Ah, the handshake, that sacred gesture of modern civility, professionalism, and the occasional bacterial exchange. It seems polite, friendly, even human. But its origins are, like most medieval customs, deeply suspicious. In the Middle Ages, people didn't shake hands to say hello. They did it to say, "Please don't murder me." Medieval Europe was a paranoid place. Everyone carried weapons. Everyone owed someone else a debt. And everyone's cousin was plotting a coup. So, when two men met, they'd extend their right hands to prove they weren't holding a dagger. The shaking part came later, a little theatrical jiggle to make sure no knife was hiding up the sleeve. It was less a greeting and more a mutual weapons inspection. Knights, merchants, and even kings used it, though usually with a sword hand, trembling from the effort of pretending to trust someone. And of course, the left-handed minority, eternally suspicious, were considered untrustworthy simply because their sword was on the other side. Medieval logic, flawless as always. By the 16th century, it evolved into a formal greeting among gentlemen, replacing bows and the ever-popular awkward silence. It became a sign of equality, a way of saying, we are both free men, capable of stabbing each other, but choosing not to. Fast forward a few centuries, and the handshake somehow became professional. Businessmen turned it from a survival tactic into a networking ritual. The same gesture once used to ensure neither party was hiding a blade now seals multi-million-dollar deals, which, let's be honest, are just the modern version of jewels, only slower and with lawyers. Even the pandemic couldn't kill it. Doctors warned us to stop shaking hands, and humanity collectively said, no, we'd rather risk plague than look rude. A very medieval mindset, really. So the next time someone grips your hand too tightly at a meeting, remember what they're really saying, I come in peace for now. The handshake isn't a symbol of trust. It's a fossil from an age when trust could get you stabbed. And given how business still works, maybe it hasn't changed that much after all. If you've ever been told to chew with your mouth closed, don't talk while eating, or stop licking the knife, congratulations. You're practicing ancient survival techniques invented by medieval people who were tired of dying from dinner. See, table manners didn't start because someone wanted to appear elegant. They started because medieval dining was horrifying. Picture a long wooden table covered in greasy trenches, basically edible plates made of stale bread with everyone using the same knife, the same bowl, and the same fingers. You didn't have your own utensils. You had hope. There were no napkins either. The standard etiquette was to wipe your hands on the nearest dog or neighbor. Monks complained about guests wiping their greasy fingers on scripture. And yes, there were rules against spitting on the table, which implies someone had to invent that rule the hard way. By the 13th century, disgust finally evolved into etiquette, manuals began circulating. Books like the Book of the Civilized Man, which taught you not to scratch yourself while eating, blow your nose in the tablecloth, or examine your teeth with the knife. These were actual instructions, meaning they weren't obvious at the time. The upper class quickly turned hygiene into hierarchy. Peasants could eat with their hands, but nobles used manners to prove superiority, a sort of social fencing match using spoons instead of swords. Eventually, manners became moral. The church decided that proper behavior at the table reflected a clean soul because nothing says holiness like daintily slurping soup. While believing in witchcraft by the Renaissance, dining had turned from survival to performance. Banquets were less about eating and more about demonstrating that you weren't a barbarian. It was Instagram culture, but with trenches. And yet those same medieval rules are still with us. Don't burp. Don't pick. Don't shout. You're not doing them to look polite. You're doing them because in another timeline, not doing them could have gotten you dysentery. You probably think the weekend was a modern invention, a triumph of labor unions, productivity science, or enlightened bosses who valued rest. Nope. It was invented by medieval peasants who wanted to stop working long enough to drink, pray, and occasionally remember what sunlight looked like. In the Middle Ages, there was no concept of a weekend. You worked until your body broke. Then you worked slightly more. But the church, in its infinite mercy, decided people should occasionally rest, not for health, of course, but to attend Mass and avoid sinning unsupervised. The church calendar was packed with feast days, sometimes up to 100 per year. These were religious holidays honoring obscure saints, the Virgin Mary, and occasionally events that sounded suspiciously like excuses for parties. Each feast day meant a day off work, free food, and the legal right to drink before noon. The nobility complained that peasants had too many holidays. One medieval bishop famously grumbled that the people work one day and rest 3. It's possibly the first recorded instance of a manager complaining about employee productivity. As the centuries passed, the Reformation trimmed the fat, literally cancelling dozens of saint days for being too fun. The Puritans, in particular, were horrified that people enjoyed resting, so they pushed for a stricter system, one mandatory day of rest, Sunday, which is how the Lord's Day slowly turned into your modern lazy day. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Factory owners noticed that overworked, miserable laborers kept breaking things, including themselves. So they reluctantly reintroduced rest days. Saturday afternoons were added later when someone realized workers who weren't exhausted made fewer accidents like falling into machinery. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend had become official. One day for God, one day for hangovers. So the next time you collapse into bed on a Saturday night, remember you're enjoying a tradition born from medieval religion, refined by Protestant guilt and perfected by capitalism's need to make you love Monday again. The weekend wasn't given to humanity out of kindness. It was a holy compromise between sin, survival, and scheduling. And somehow, we're still thanking God for it. When you slide on a wedding ring today, you're not just declaring eternal love. You're reenacting a medieval property exchange. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It was an economic transaction with decorative vows. Love came after the paperwork. Usually followed by regret and joint land management. The ring wasn't a symbol of devotion. It was a receipt. The origin of the ring goes way back to ancient Egypt, where circular bands symbolized eternity. The idea traveled through Rome, where men gave rings to women as proof of ownership. By the time it reached medieval Europe, the church realized this was excellent PR, a symbol of faithfulness that doubled as a legal shackle. The ring was placed on the fourth finger of the left hand because people believed a vein of love, the vena amoris, ran directly to the heart. This was complete nonsense. Medieval science also thought headaches came from demons and that leeches had medical degrees. But the myth stuck, mostly because it sounded poetic enough to justify the expense of gold. Weddings themselves were barely religious until the church got involved. Before that it was common law. You said "I do" in front of witnesses, shook hands, and boom, legally married. The church saw a business opportunity. Soon only unions blessed by clergy were valid and rings became mandatory props. And don't be fooled. Those early rings were rarely worn by men. For centuries, the ring was a one-way symbol, a woman's visible sign of possession, not partnership. Husbands didn't start wearing them until the 20th century, when World War II soldiers began sporting rings to remember their wives or remind everyone they were taken, even overseas. Now, the wedding ring is everywhere, a tiny halo of metal that supposedly represents love, trust, and eternity. Until someone forgets it on the bathroom sink. So when you glance at that band of gold, remember what it really means. Not eternal romance, not divine blessing. It's a medieval merger agreement that survived every cultural collapse since the Crusades.